Hello students, this is a video tutorial explaining your motif project for The Great Gatsby. And the first thing I want to do is explain what the word motifs mean when we're talking about literature. So motifs are repeated elements within the story. And an author uses these motifs really intentionally to kind of provide a message to their story. And a lot of times these motifs help develop the theme of the story. So there are these repeated things that we keep seeing throughout the story. They might actually develop into symbolic meaning. They might not. But they're these elements that we keep seeing again and again. And we as readers should note when authors use repetition. And we've been looking at that in the context of rhetoric a lot this year, that when an author uses repetition, it's to emphasize something, and we need to figure out what that is that's being emphasized. The same thing in novels or plays or pieces of literature. When we start noticing that an author is repeating certain elements, that should be a reminder to us to pay attention and figure out why. And in novels, these motifs might not be repetition of like the exact same word or phrase like we've seen in rhetoric. Um, and so that's why I'm using the word elements. And as we look at The Great Gatsby, there's some things like color is really emphasized by the author. So we need to think, okay, if we're seeing colors all the time, then what do these colors mean? And colors already have some symbolic meaning within our culture, so we can kind of take some of our prior knowledge and start connecting it to what the author's doing within the text. For instance, red often refers to maybe anger or passion or love, these really strong emotions. White often is used to project kind of innocence. Green often refers to jealousy or money, sometimes both of those at the same time. So we already have these kind of symbolic meanings, and then authors will then take that and use it for their own purposes. So the meaning might be a little different than what we're used to. So we need to be aware of that. But at the same time, we can start thinking, okay, this is culturally what's going on here. These are the connotations that these have. So what's the author then doing with it? That's just one example of a motif. There's tons of other motifs, but I just want to make it clear that it's not necessarily just an exact word or phrase that's repeated, but like these ideas and elements that get repeated too. With your project, we're not going to do a ton of like reading comprehension questions like maybe you're familiar with in other English classes. We will have a little bit of that just to show that you're being responsible for your reading. But the main assignment I'm having you work on is a project with your motifs, okay? And for The Great Gatsby, I think I have like 18 different motifs you can choose from. So you're going to choose one of them. Please only follow one of them. And you're going to be finding 40 quotations as you're reading that are using your motif. Okay, and here's how you're going to track them. We are going to be reading The Great Gatsby as a PDF in Kami. And whenever you find a quote in your book, you're going to highlight it or mark it with the little comment box dot where you want to make your comment. This is actually an example from a student for the book The Sun Also Rises, so it's not The Great Gatsby. You're going to put a dot. Then you're going to put M for motif and then the number of motif that you have. So you're going to start M1, M2, okay? And then you're going to kind of explain why you chose it. So you're either going to explain how it connects to your motif, or as you read more and more of the book, you might start thinking, how does this connect to other things that the author's already been saying with the motif? Because hopefully as you're reading, you're going to be thinking about, oh, like this is the pattern that's starting to develop. This is what I think the author's trying to say with the motif. All right, so I'm going to go over your different choices for this. And this will also help you understand some of the deeper issues. Even if you're not following some of these motifs, just going over these will help you kind of have a better understanding for some of the things to look for in this book. So your first choice is this idea of wealth in the novel. So if you're tracking this, you are looking for quotations that have ideas about riches, people, the American dream. They could be positive or they could be negative. in the opportunities that are given to the wealthy. And this book literally starts with the author talking about remembering advice that his dad gave him, that not everyone has the same advantages you have. And they're talking about privilege here and the privilege that comes with this kind of wealth. So the book literally starts there. All right, so that's the first motif. Your second motif has to do with the past. This has to do with both history and it also has to do with one's personal past. And every character's past in this book defines them. Now, a lot of them try to deny their past, or some of them try to reclaim their past. But there's this real question in the book of whether you can repeat the past, whether the past becomes repeatable. All right, so you're looking at the idea of what happens in the past. And because of this, the book goes back and forth from the present to the past, present to the past. And we learn more and more about the characters as we learn more and more about their past. The way that Fitzgerald builds suspense with this is actually I love it. I think it's an interesting way to write a novel. All right, number 3. Fitzgerald was considered a spokesperson for his generation when he wrote about life in the 1920s. And in this particular book, he really kind of talks about some of the morality of the people he saw representative of his time. And there were a lot of questions about morality, one's sense of right and wrong, and changes in morality and the way people acted. And in this book, there's a lot of immorality, people doing a lot of the wrong things. So you can both track good actions, but probably you're going to be tracking a lot of sketchy actions here if you decide that motif. All right, motif number 4. Our book is told from the perspective, it's told in first person from the perspective of Nick Carraway. And he is both an observer of this story, like he's kind of standing in the background watching some of this happen, and he's also a participant in the story. Like he's interacting with the characters and he's making things happen in the story too through his actions. And whenever we have a first-person narrator, we should always kind of question whether they're reliable, whether we trust their story. And you probably, this probably happens with some of your friends. So you might know a friend that their stories and perspectives are always really reliable and you trust them. You might have other friends and you absolutely love them as a person, but you know that they tend to exaggerate, or you know that they tend to give you the more negative version, or you know that they always make themselves look better than what really happened when they tell stories. And I think now that I've been married for 13 years now, my husband knows that I have a tendency to exaggerate when I tell stories. So I'm not trustworthy narrator. So he I think, just reinterprets what I'm saying whenever I tell stories. But Nick Carraway, in some ways is sort of reliable, but there are times when we're kind of questioning his view of the story, and that's okay. That makes for a really complex, good story. So you're going to look for passages that illuminate his perspective. What helps us understand Nick Carraway? All right, motif 5 has to do with judgment and human nature. This kind of connects to motif 4 because our narrator talks all the time about how he doesn't judge people. He starts the book by saying that, basically. Don't judge people. They haven't had the same advantages you have. And then he spends the rest of the book judging people. And so this is looking for situations in which people are judging other people. Has happened for a long time. All right, motif 6 has to do with hopes and dreams. And this is kind of the American dream story. And there's a lot of hopes and wanting things to happen and dreaming about a better future. So you're tracking that if you are choosing number 6. All right, number 7, the effects of the characters struggling with illusion and reality. Okay, so illusion is kind of not real and what you want to be happening but isn't actually happening, or having kind of a fake understanding what's happening. And then there's reality, and some of our characters are kind of living in alternate universes where they want something to be happening and they like to think something's happening but it might actually not be happening. All right, motif 8. Shakespeare once said, and this is a paraphrase, that the only way to keep a secret can be kept between two people is if one of them is dead. Okay, and that may be kind of true. Okay, The characters in this book, though, often are good at keeping secrets, and there's a lot of secrets in this book. And then sometimes they're not great at keeping secrets. And there's a lot of power that lies behind these secrets in the book. And even we as readers, because we're kind of limited to what Nick Carraway, the narrator, is telling us, we as readers don't always know the whole truth. Or Fitzgerald, our author, is really intentional about how he reveals the truth to us over time and reveals it to Nick Carraway or through Nick Carraway. So if you're tracking motif 8, you're tracking these secrets. All right, motif number 9. Ashes, fire, and dust are recurring motifs in the story. So you're looking for passages that reference ashes, fire, and dust in any form. There are candlelight flames, so that would count as fire. Okay, students that track this, I think they enjoy tracking it, and it's really important to track, but they really have to be paying attention to things, like the candlelight. Oh, right, like that's fire. So you kind of have to be on it as far as remembering that that's what you're looking for. All right, motif 10, and we have looked at this in some of our pre-reading already, but socioeconomic and social status is not constant for all the characters. Some of them are changing between social status and social class throughout the book. And here you are noting changes that happen within that. All right, motif 11. This has to do with geography. So anytime you see geography in this book, you are tracking it. And we're going to talk about this more and more, but throughout the book. But you have two really distinct kind of sections of the suburbs of New York City. You have East and West Egg. But you also have the story being told in parts in Louisville, Kentucky, in the Midwest. And New York City itself, there's like the city and then moving out from the city. There's a lot of movement between spaces and time. And even though a lot of the story takes place in New York City, this is a story about people from the Midwest, and that matters. Fitzgerald's kind of doing something with this novel and trying to explain like geography and movement across this country as an important part of this story. Motif 12 is colors. I already mentioned this, but this is probably the easiest one to track. But if you're tracking it, I really want you to, in your comments, start noting some of the things that you're remembering are the same, okay? When does white show up all the time? When does gold show up all the time? When does green show up? What do they have in common? I really want your comments to become increasingly in depth as you're doing this. It's easy to find them. It's harder to try to figure out like what the commonalities are. Okay, motif 13 are images of violence. There's a lot of violence in this book. And who is the victim? Who are the perpetrators? And so you can include that. All right, motif 14 is corruption. That is kind of like dishonesty to do crimes. And I'm going to actually look up this definition because I want to make sure I'm describing it. Dishonest or fraudulent conduct by those in power. Okay? It's people abusing their power to do the wrong thing. And corruption was pretty common in the 1920s all the way up, through the executive branch of government. And you're going to look at corruption. There is a professional golfer in our story that cheats all the time. There is illegal business practices going on. There's a lot of fraud. All right, motif 15. Sources say there are over 400 references to time in the novel and 85 uses of the word time itself. You don't have to track all of them, but you're going to... I don't even know what this... I think I accidentally typed some stuff in. So you're just tracking ideas of time, okay? I don't know what happened here. Okay. And what does that tell us about some of the themes in the book, this passage of time? Motif 16 has to do with the automobile. I've had students say that They've said it is hard to find quotes for this, but I think there's quotes all over the place. You just need to be a careful reader for this one. But cars are really important, and when you think about it, our cars have played a really huge symbol within American history, right? Like they're a sign of freedom and independence. Like when you get your license and when you get your first car, that's a big deal. And it's kind of bigger than just the car itself. It's like what that means to you. Well, think about that for the whole United States and what it means to be able to travel and to be able to get away and to have that kind of ownership. And the people that have cars in this book generally have a lot of money and privilege too. They're often using it to then commit their crimes. So the automobile is really important in the novel. Okay. And I lied. There's 16, not 18. So easier to choose from, I guess. All right, so that's what you have for your motifs. You're going to choose one of those. And as we read through the book, occasionally I'll kind of stop and say, if you're following this motif, make sure that you're tracking this. And especially in the first chapter, we're going to read the first chapter really slowly together to kind of give you some help in making sure that you feel confident and you know what you're doing with this tracking. All right, thank you, everyone.